Welcome, my friends. I am Mr. Dark, and tonight I'm taking you on a journey into the depths of fear, a tale of a cursed town where shadows never sleep and escape is never guaranteed. Black Hollow isn't just a name, it's a place that devours the souls of those who wander too close, binding them in a web of darkness and despair. But what happens when the curse demands a sacrifice, and the price is higher than anyone could imagine? Stay with me as we unravel this chilling story of survival, betrayal, and the haunting echoes of a past that refuses to die. But be warned, this isn't a story for the faint of heart. Welcome to the shadows. Welcome to Black Hollow. On a chilly autumn evening, a small group of friends, Nathan, Emily, Dylan, and Sarah, were huddled around a campfire at a national park near British Columbia. The air was crisp, and the golden hues of fallen leaves painted the surrounding forest. Dylan, always the storyteller, leaned forward and said, "Have you guys heard of the abandoned town of Black Hollow? It's only a couple of hours from here." Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Is that one of those ghost towns from the Gold Rush era?" Dylan nodded, his face lit by the flickering fire. "Yeah, but it's not just any ghost town. People say it's cursed. Anyone who goes there disappears." Nathan laughed, shaking his head. "Classic campfire story, Dylan. Let me guess. The ghost of a woman haunts the place." Dylan smirked. "Close. It's worse. They say she was a settler in the late 1800s, betrayed by the people she trusted the most. Now, her spirit prowls the ruins, looking for anyone foolish enough to wander in." Emily, the skeptic of the group, rolled her eyes. "Come on, you don't actually believe that, do you? It's probably just an old mining town with a few creaky buildings and overgrown trails." "I'm just saying," Dylan replied. "There's a reason no one ever tries to rebuild the place. Even locals won't go near it. People hear footsteps in the woods and see lights in the windows of empty cabins." "Let's check it out," Nathan said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "We've been hiking for days. This could be a cool change of pace." Emily hesitated. "I don't know. Creepy old towns aren't exactly my idea of fun." Sarah shrugged. "It's probably just a bunch of rotting cabins. What's the worst that could happen? We go, take a few photos, and come back with a spooky story." Dylan grinned. "Exactly. Let's do it. Black Hollow is only a short drive from here. We can head out in the morning." The next day, the group packed their gear and set off. The drive to Black Hollow was uneventful, but as they approached the outskirts of the ghost town, the atmosphere began to shift. The road became narrower, flanked by dense forests that seemed to grow darker despite the midday sun. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it an eerie stillness. When they arrived, the sight before them was both haunting and fascinating. The town consisted of a few dilapidated buildings, their wooden frames sagging under years of neglect. A church steeple rose crookedly against the sky, and an old general store stood with shattered windows, its sign barely legible. Emily frowned. "This place is giving me the creeps. Are we sure this is a good idea?" Nathan laughed. "Don't tell me you're scared already. It's just an old town." Dylan pulled out his phone to document their exploration. "Let's split up and check out different spots. We'll cover more ground that way." Sarah shot him a nervous glance. "Split up? Have you never seen a horror movie? That's how people die." "Fine," Dylan conceded. "We'll stick together." As they walked through the town, they noticed strange details. Doors creaked open on their own, and faded footprints lingered in the dirt, despite years of abandonment. A rusted swing set swayed in the breeze, though there was no wind strong enough to move it. Shadows seemed to shift in their peripheral vision, but when they turned to look, nothing was there. At the edge of the town, they stumbled upon a cabin that seemed eerily intact compared to the others. The windows were clean, and the door was slightly ajar. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she said, "I don't think we should go in there." Nathan smirked. "You're no fun. It's probably just better preserved because it's sheltered by the trees." Before anyone could stop him, Nathan pushed the door open. The air inside was musty, and a faint floral scent lingered, as if someone had just left moments ago. The group entered cautiously, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The room was sparsely furnished, with a single rocking chair in the corner and a table with a faded tablecloth. On the mantel above a stone fireplace sat a porcelain doll, its painted eyes staring blankly into the room. Emily shuddered. "This place feels wrong." As Dylan approached the fireplace, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind them. Everyone jumped, their breaths quickening. "Probably just the wind," Nathan muttered, though his voice wavered. But then they heard it, a faint sound, like someone whispering their names. Sarah clutched Emily's arm. "Tell me you heard that." Emily nodded, her face pale. "Let's get out of here." Before they could leave, the rocking chair began to move on its own, creaking slowly back and forth. Dylan froze, his phone still in his hand. That's not normal. As panic set in, they bolted out of the cabin, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Outside, the daylight had dimmed unnaturally, and the trees seemed to close in around them. "What the hell was that?" Sarah gasped, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Nathan said, glancing back at the cabin. "But I think we should leave, now." As they made their way back to the car, a figure appeared in the distance. A woman in a long, tattered dress, standing at the edge of the town. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her presence sent a jolt of fear through them. "Who's that?" Emily whispered. "I don't think we want to find out," Dylan replied. But the woman raised a hand, pointing directly at them. Her voice echoed through the air, cold and sharp. "You shouldn't have come here." The group stood frozen, staring at the shadowy figure pointing toward them. The woman's voice echoed, sharp and cold. "You shouldn't have come here." "Did she just talk?" Emily whispered, clutching Sarah's arm. "Of course she talked," Nathan hissed. "But who the hell is she?" Before anyone could answer, the figure began moving toward them, her steps slow but deliberate. Her dress trailed across the ground, as though gliding rather than walking. The group instinctively backed away. "Run," Dylan muttered, his voice barely audible over his thundering heartbeat. And they did. The four friends sprinted toward their car, their footsteps crunching against the gravel road. Behind them, the woman's voice rose again, layered with an otherworldly resonance. "You cannot leave. You are marked." Nathan reached the car first, fumbling with his keys. "Get in! Get in!" he shouted, his voice shaking as his fingers struggled to unlock the door. The others piled in, slamming the doors shut, just as the figure reached the edge of the clearing. She stopped there, her silhouette illuminated by the car's headlights. Her face was hidden in shadow, but her presence felt suffocating. Nathan finally got the car started, and the engine roared to life. He floored the gas pedal, and the tires kicked up dirt as they sped away from Black Hollow. The drive back to their campsite was tense. No one spoke at first, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. Emily broke the silence. "What the hell was that? Did we just see a ghost?" Nathan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "It was probably just some local messing with us." "Messing with us?" Sarah snapped. "Did you hear her voice? Did you see how she moved? That was not some local." Dylan, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. "She said we're marked. What does that mean?" "It doesn't mean anything," Nathan insisted, though his voice betrayed his fear. "It's just someone trying to scare us out of their creepy little town." Emily wasn't convinced. "If it was just a prank, how do you explain the rocking chair, the whispers, That place was wrong. Sarah nodded, her face pale. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Let's just get back to camp and pretend this never happened. But pretending was impossible. When they arrived back at their campsite, the forest felt different, darker, quieter. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the wind had died down, leaving the trees eerily still. Nathan parked the car, but no one moved to get out. Finally, Dylan sighed and opened the door. We're fine. We just spooked ourselves, that's all. The others followed hesitantly, their eyes darting nervously around the campsite. The fire pit they had left smoldering earlier was now completely extinguished, though no one had put it out. Great, Nathan muttered, kneeling to relight it. We're going to freeze out here. As he struck a match, Sarah gasped. Wait, do you hear that? Everyone fell silent. At first, there was nothing, but then faintly they heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps on dried leaves. It seemed to come from the trees surrounding them, circling the campsite. Probably just animals, Nathan said, though his voice quivered. Since when do animals wear boots? Dylan replied, his eyes scanning the darkness. Emily grabbed a flashlight from her pack and shone it toward the forest. The beam of light swept over the trees, illuminating nothing but twisted branches and scattered leaves. There's nothing there. The footsteps stopped. For a moment the group breathed a collective sigh of relief. But then the whispering began. It started faint, like a breeze rustling through the leaves, but quickly grew louder. The voices were indistinct at first, a garbled chorus of murmurs. Then, one by one, the whispers began to coalesce into words. Why did you come here? Turn back. You're not safe. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Sarah let out a sharp scream as the voices grew louder, more insistent. Leave! They seemed to roar in unison. Nathan grabbed a piece of wood from the fire pit and waved it blindly into the darkness. Show yourself! Are you crazy? Emily hissed, pulling him back. Don't provoke it! Before anyone could react, the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. For a long moment, no one moved, afraid to break the fragile quiet. Then, from the edge of the campsite, a single, haunting laugh echoed through the night. They barely slept that night. Huddled in their tents, each of them lay awake, listening for any sign of movement outside. But aside from the occasional rustle of leaves, the night passed uneventfully. When morning came, the group was exhausted but eager to leave. Packing up their gear quickly, they loaded the car and headed for the nearest town. The plan was to find a cafe, regroup, and figure out what to do next. The small diner they found was quaint and unassuming, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh coffee wafting through the air. They took a corner booth, and a kind-looking waitress approached with a warm smile. "What can I get for you folks?" she asked, her pen poised over a notepad. "Coffee," Nathan said. "Lots of coffee." As the waitress walked away, Dylan leaned in, his voice low. "We need to figure out what's happening. That woman, whatever she was, said we're marked. Do you think it's some kind of curse?" "Don't be ridiculous," Nathan replied. "Curses aren't real." Emily shot him a glare. "And ghosts are." "Look," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Whether it's real or not, something is wrong. We need to figure out how to fix it before—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Before what?" Nathan asked. "Before some ghost lady comes after us. You're being paranoid." "Am I?" Sarah snapped. "Because I don't think the voices last night were a figment of my imagination." The waitress returned with their coffees, and the group fell silent until she walked away. Dylan pulled out his phone and started searching for information on Black Hollow. There's got to be something online about that town. After a few minutes, he frowned. There's not much, just a couple of old blog posts about it being haunted. No one knows why, though. Great, Emily muttered. We're cursed by a ghost with no backstory. Nathan rolled his eyes. We're not cursed. We just need to calm down and... But before he could finish, his coffee mug slid across the table on its own, tipping over and spilling its contents onto his lap. He yelped in surprise and pain, jumping to his feet. The other patrons in the diner turned to stare as the group exchanged nervous glances. It wasn't over yet. Whatever had marked them was just getting started. The group left the diner in a tense silence. Nathan's pants were still damp from the coffee spill, and the eerie way the mug had moved on its own lingered in their minds. They piled into the car, Nathan gripping the steering wheel tightly as he drove back toward the park where they had left their tents. "Do you think it followed us?" Sarah asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily glanced at her, frowning. "How could it? We're miles away from that place." "That's the thing about curses," Dylan muttered. "They don't care about distance." Nathan slammed his palm on the wheel. "Enough with the curse nonsense. It was just a stupid accident with the coffee. Can we stop freaking out over nothing?" No one replied. The car fell into an uneasy quiet as they wound through the forest roads. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the road ahead. But then, as they approached the park, the air changed again. The golden hues of the forest seemed duller, and the temperature inside the car dropped noticeably. Emily rubbed her arms, shivering. "Is it colder in here, or is it just me?" she asked. Nathan frowned. "I didn't touch the air conditioning." As the words left his mouth, the radio crackled to life, filling the car with static. Nathan reached to turn it off, but it stayed on, the static growing louder and louder until a voice cut through. "You can't escape." Everyone froze. Nathan yanked at the knob, twisting it frantically, but the voice continued. "You are ours now." The radio suddenly went silent, and the air in the car grew heavy, oppressive. Nathan pulled over, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Okay, what the hell was that?" No one answered. They sat there, breathing heavily, until Sarah whispered, "It's not just a ghost. It's attached to us." "Don't say that," Nathan snapped. "We'll figure this out. We just need to..." Before he could finish, the car began to shake violently, as if something, or someone, was slamming against it. The windows rattled, and the group screamed, huddling together as the car rocked on its wheels. "Get out!" the voice boomed, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Nathan threw the car into gear and sped off, the shaking stopping as suddenly as it had started. No one said a word for the rest of the drive. Back at the campsite, the group scrambled out of the car, their nerves frayed. Emily paced near the fire pit while Dylan sat on a log, his head in his hands. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "If it's following us, we need to get as far away as possible." "And go where?" Nathan snapped. "Back to town? To another campsite? It's not going to matter if this thing is attached to us." "Maybe there's a way to break it," Dylan suggested. "I mean, every curse has a way to lift it, right?" Emily stopped pacing and turned to him. "And how do you suggest we figure that out, Dylan?" "Call a ghostbuster. Perform an exorcism." "Calm down," Nathan yelled. "All this yelling isn't helping." Emily glared at him. "What's your plan then, Nathan?" "Pretend nothing's happening until we all disappear one by one." Nathan opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, a rustling sound came from the edge of the campsite. Everyone froze, their eyes darting to the trees. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. The rustling grew louder, closer. Emily grabbed the flashlight again, her hand trembling as she shone it toward the noise. The beam landed on a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was the woman from Black Hollow. Her long dress was tattered and stained, and her face was obscured by shadows. But this time, she wasn't alone. More figures stood behind her, their outlines barely visible in the darkness. Their eyes glowed faintly, watching. "Run," Dylan whispered. But before they could move, the woman stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You were warned." Nathan stepped in front of the group, holding up the flashlight like a weapon. "What do you want from us?" The woman tilted her head, her movements unnaturally fluid. "You trespassed. You saw what you should not have. Now, you belong to us." "That's not fair," Sarah shouted. "We didn't mean any harm. We didn't know." The woman smiled, a cold, chilling expression. "Ignorance does not absolve you." Suddenly, the figures behind her began to move, stepping closer. Their faces were pale, gaunt, their eyes hollow sockets that glowed faintly in the dark. The group backed away until they were pressed against the car. "Please," Emily begged, tears streaming down her face. "We'll leave. We'll never come back." The woman raised a hand, and the figures stopped. Her head tilted again, as if considering Emily's plea. "There is a way to free yourselves," she said, her voice soft but menacing. "How?" Dylan asked, his voice shaking. The woman's smile widened. "Bring me another soul." The group stared at her in horror. "What?" Nathan asked, his voice barely audible. "You heard me," the woman said. "Bring someone else to Black Hollow, someone who will stay, and I will release you." "No," Emily said firmly. "We're not doing that." "Then you will stay," the woman replied, her tone final. Without another word, she and the other figures melted into the shadows, leaving the group trembling and terrified. The group sat around the fire, too scared to move or sleep. The ultimatum hung heavy in the air, suffocating them. "We can't do it," Emily said, breaking the silence. "We can't bring someone else into this. It's wrong." "And what happens if we don't?" Nathan snapped. "We stay haunted forever? No thanks." Sarah hugged her knees to her chest, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe there's another way. Maybe we can break the curse without doing that." Dylan shook his head. "You heard her. That's the only way." "She could be lying," Emily argued. "Even if we did it, there's no guarantee she'd keep her word." Nathan stood, pacing. "We don't have a choice. It's us or someone else. I say we find someone." "Stop," Sarah interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "We're not murderers." "Then you better start saying your goodbyes," Nathan said coldly. "Because if we don't do something soon, we're all dead." The group fell silent, the crackling fire the only sound as the weight of their predicament sank in. The fire crackled in the silence, casting long, flickering shadows over the group. Sarah stared into the flames, her fingers gripping her knees tightly. Emily sat beside her, trying to calm her own trembling hands. Dylan paced back and forth, his mind racing, while Nathan stood apart, his face set in cold determination. "We have to make a decision," Nathan said, breaking the quiet. "If we wait too long, that thing, whatever it is, will come for us." Emily looked up, her eyes flashing with anger. "You're actually considering it? You're seriously suggesting we sacrifice someone else?" Nathan shrugged, though his jaw was tight. "It's us or them. That's the deal." "That's not a deal," Sarah snapped. "It's a death sentence for someone else. How can you even think about doing that?" "Because I'm not ready to die," Nathan shot back, his voice rising. "None of us are. And if you think sitting around and hoping for a miracle is going to save us, you're delusional." Dylan stopped pacing and sighed. "Look, we're all scared. But Emily's right. What if it's a trick? What if we bring someone there and she doesn't let us go anyway?" Nathan glared at him. "Then what do you suggest, Dylan?" "Huh? Do you have a better plan?" because sitting here debating morality isn't going to fix this. We don't even know what we're dealing with, Emily shouted. This isn't some horror movie where the rules are clear. We need to think this through. Nathan scoffed. Thinking it through got us nowhere last night. That thing followed us here. It's not going to stop until we do what it wants. Or until we find another way, Sarah said softly. Her voice trembled, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. There has to be another way. Nathan shook his head in frustration. You're wasting time. Every second we wait, we get closer to being dragged into whatever hellhole that thing came from. Then leave, Emily said, her voice sharp. If you're so desperate to save yourself, go, but don't expect us to be a part of it. Nathan stared at her, his expression dark. Fine, maybe I will. The group fell into an uneasy silence as Nathan stormed off toward his tent. Sarah watched him go, her stomach churning with dread. He's not actually going to... I don't know, Dylan said quietly, but I don't think he's bluffing. That night, the air around the campsite felt heavier, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. The wind had picked up, whispering through the trees like voices just out of reach. No one could sleep. Sarah sat outside her tent, clutching a flashlight and staring into the darkness. What do we do if he goes through with it? She asked, her voice barely audible. Emily, sitting beside her, sighed deeply. I don't know. I can't stop thinking about what that thing said, that we're marked. What if no matter what we do, it's already too late? Dylan emerged from his tent, rubbing his temples. It's not too late, but we have to stick together. If Nathan... A rustling sound interrupted him, coming from the edge of the campsite. All three of them froze, their eyes darting toward the noise. Emily raised her flashlight, the beam trembling as it swept across the trees. Who's there? She called, her voice cracking. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then, a figure stepped into the light. It was Nathan. Jesus, Nathan, Dylan snapped. What the hell are you doing creeping around like that? Nathan didn't answer right away. He stood there, his face pale and his eyes wide, as if he'd seen something horrific. I was just checking the car, he said finally, his voice hollow. Sarah frowned. Why? Because I don't trust that we can stay here, he replied, his gaze darting to the trees. We're sitting ducks out in the open like this. Emily narrowed her eyes. You're lying. What? Nathan snapped, his voice rising. What are you talking about? You're lying, Emily repeated, standing up and stepping closer to him. You weren't at the car. You went somewhere else, didn't you? Nathan took a step back, his jaw tightening. I don't have to explain myself to you. Dylan moved closer, his expression wary. What did you do, Nathan? Nothing, Nathan shouted. I didn't do anything, okay? Then why do you look like you've seen a ghost? Emily pressed. Nathan's hands clenched into fists, his voice breaking. Because I did. All right? She's out there, watching us. She knows we're scared, and she's waiting for us to fall apart. The group exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of his words sinking in. Emily softened slightly. Nathan, if you really saw her, we need to know. Did she say anything? He hesitated, then shook his head. She just stared at me. But I know what she wants, and I know she's not going to stop until we give it to her. Then we don't give her what she wants, Sarah said firmly. We can find another way. Nathan laughed bitterly. You keep saying that, but you don't have a clue what that way is, do you? Maybe not, Sarah admitted. But I'd rather keep looking than give up and let someone else die because of us. Nathan stared at her for a long moment, then sighed and turned away. Believe what you want, but I'm done waiting for this thing to kill us. With that, he walked back to his tent, leaving the rest of the group standing in tense silence. Later that night, the whispers returned. Sarah woke to the sound of her name, faint but unmistakable. She sat up in her sleeping bag, her heart pounding. "Hello," she whispered. No answer. She reached for her flashlight, but before she could turn it on, the whispers grew louder, surrounding her. "Help us! Save us!" The voices were distorted, layered, and filled with anguish. Sarah's breathing quickened. She unzipped her tent and stepped out into the cold night air. The fire had died down to embers, and the campsite was eerily quiet. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. The whispers stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then, from the edge of the trees, the woman appeared again. Her dark silhouette stood motionless, but Sarah could feel her cold gaze piercing through the darkness. "You still have time," the woman said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Sarah took a shaky step back. "What do you want from us?" The woman tilted her head. "I already told you. Bring me a soul, or stay with me forever." "I won't do it," Sarah whispered. The woman's smile widened. "We'll see." And with that, she vanished into the shadows, leaving Sarah trembling and alone in the dark. Morning came sluggishly, the light grey and muted beneath thick clouds. The campsite looked lifeless, as if drained by the events of the night. Sarah sat near the fire pit, her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the dying embers. She hadn't slept since her encounter with the woman. Emily emerged from her tent, her face pale and drawn. She took one look at Sarah and crouched down beside her. "You saw her again, didn't you?" she asked softly. Sarah nodded, her lips trembling. She said the same thing, "Bring her a soul or stay forever." Emily shivered, wrapping her jacket tighter around herself. "We need to get out of here." "Where would we even go?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow. "She's not going to let us leave. She's following us." Dylan joined them, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "If she's following us, maybe we should go back to Black Hollow." "What?" Emily snapped, glaring at him. "Why would we go back there? That's what she wants." "Exactly," Dylan replied. "She's anchored to that place. If we go back, maybe we can figure out how to break the curse." Emily shook her head vehemently. No way. That's walking straight into her trap." Dylan sighed. "Do you have a better idea? Because running away isn't working, and I'm not willing to wait around until she decides to drag us into whatever nightmare world she's from." "Stop," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. "Arguing isn't helping. We need to figure this out together." As the three of them tried to regain some semblance of calm, Nathan emerged from his tent. His movements were sluggish, and his face was pale and drawn, as though he hadn't slept at all. He didn't greet them, didn't say a word, just slumped down on a log near the fire pit. "Rough night?" Dylan asked, though his tone carried more tension than sympathy. Nathan ignored him, staring into the distance with glassy eyes. Emily frowned, watching him. "Nathan, are you okay?" He didn't respond. Instead, he stood abruptly and walked toward the car. "I'm leaving," he said flatly. "What?" Sarah said, standing. "You can't just leave." Nathan turned to her, his expression hard. "Why not? Staying here is pointless. We're not getting out of this unless we play by her rules, and you all are too afraid to do what needs to be done." "You're really willing to sacrifice someone else to save yourself?" Emily asked, her voice trembling with anger. Nathan stepped closer, his voice low and cold. "If it means I get to live, yeah, I am." "Then you're no better than her," Emily shot back. "Maybe I'm not," Nathan said, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "But at least I'll still be alive." Before anyone could stop him, Nathan got into the car and started the engine. The others watched in stunned silence as he drove off, the sound of the tires fading into the distance. Hours passed. The three remaining friends sat in the cold silence of the forest, the weight of Nathan's departure pressing heavily on them. "What do we do now?" Dylan finally asked, breaking the stillness. Sarah shook her head, her voice weak. "I don't know. I feel like no matter what we choose, we lose." Emily stared into the trees, her jaw clenched. "We don't lose. Not to her." "What are you talking about?" Dylan asked. Emily turned to face them, her eyes fierce. "There has to be something we're missing. Some reason why she's bound to Black Hollow. If we can figure that out, maybe we can break her hold." Sarah frowned. "Like what? A ritual? An object tying her to this world?" "Something," Emily said. "Curses like this don't just happen. They're made." "She's right," Dylan said, nodding slowly. "If we can find out how it started, maybe we can end it." "But how?" Sarah asked. "We don't even know who she is." Dylan pulled out his phone, scrolling through search results for Black Hollow. "We start with what we know. Black Hollow is an abandoned town with a dark history. There's got to be something in its past that ties to her." As he searched, Emily walked to the car, rummaging through the trunk until she found a map of the area. "We'll need to go back," she said, spreading the map out on the ground. "If there's anything to find, it's there." Sarah's eyes widened. "Back? Emily, are you serious? We barely made it out alive." "I'm not saying it's safe," Emily replied, her voice firm. "But it's our only option." Dylan nodded. "She's right. If we stay here, we're just sitting ducks. At least back at Black Hollow, we might find answers." Sarah hesitated, fear twisting in her chest. But the determination in Emily's eyes was unwavering, and Dylan's logic was hard to argue against. "Fine," Sarah said finally. "But if we're doing this, we stick together. No splitting up." "Agreed," Dylan said, folding the map and slipping it into his jacket. The three of them packed what little gear they needed and prepared to leave. The tension in the air was thick, every rustle of leaves making them flinch. They didn't know what awaited them at Black Hollow, but the only way to end this was to face it head-on. The drive back to Black Hollow was nerve-wracking. The sky grew darker with each passing mile, the clouds thick and heavy with the promise of rain. The road seemed longer this time, the forest denser, as though the world itself was conspiring against them. When they arrived, the town looked even more desolate than before. The buildings leaned precariously, their wooden frames groaning in the wind. The air was colder, sharper, and carried a strange metallic tang that made the group uneasy. As they stepped out of the car, the oppressive silence of Black Hollow settled over them like a shroud. Emily clutched the map tightly, her eyes scanning the buildings. "We start at the church," she said. "If there's any record of what happened here, it'll be there." The three of them moved cautiously toward the crooked steeple that jutted against the darkening sky. The heavy wooden door creaked as Dylan pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty nave. Inside, the church was eerily pristine, as if untouched by time. The pews were neatly aligned, the altar draped in a faded white cloth. But the air was thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were watching. "Search everything," Emily whispered, her voice hushed. "There's got to be something here." Sarah moved toward the altar, her fingers brushing over the cloth. Beneath it, she found a tattered journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. She opened it, her heart racing as she skimmed the pages. "It's a ledger," she said. "It lists the people who lived here and how they died." "What does it say?" Dylan asked, moving to stand beside her. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the pages. "A woman. She was accused of witchcraft. They blamed her for a string of deaths. It says she was executed, burned alive." Emily's blood ran cold. She must be the one haunting this place. "Wait," Dylan said, pointing to a passage. "It says she cursed the town with her dying breath. She swore she'd make them suffer, make them pay for what they did to her. Her curse, Sarah murmured. That's what's keeping her here. But why us? Dylan asked. What did we do? Emily frowned. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe she's just lashing out at anyone who trespasses. A sudden chill filled the room, and the sound of soft, mocking laughter echoed through the church. The three of them froze, their blood turning to ice as the woman's voice filled the air. You're too late. The woman's chilling laughter reverberated through the church, echoing off the walls as though the building itself was mocking them. Emily, Sarah, and Dylan stood frozen, their breaths shallow and hearts racing. The temperature inside the church plummeted, their visible breaths forming small clouds in the air. You think you can undo this? The woman's voice taunted, disembodied but everywhere at once. You don't understand what you've stepped into. Show yourself, Emily shouted, her voice trembling but defiant. A shadow moved at the far end of the nave, coalescing into a faint outline of the woman. Her tattered dress seemed to merge with the air around her, and her dark eyes bore into them with an intensity that sent chills down their spines. You're not the first, she said, her voice heavy with malice, and you won't be the last. What do you mean? Sarah managed to ask, her voice quivering. The woman stepped closer, her figure flickering like a dying flame. For decades they came here, wanderers, explorers, fools like you, all of them thinking they could uncover the secrets of Black Hollow, all of them thinking they could escape. Dylan took a step forward, trying to keep his voice steady. Who are you? What happened to you? The woman's expression twisted, her face darkening with rage. I am justice. I am vengeance. I am what they made me. The journal in Sarah's hands trembled as though alive, the pages flipping wildly on their own. She gripped it tightly, staring at the ink that seemed to bleed across the paper, forming a single word. Miriam. Miriam, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Your name was Miriam. At the sound of her name, the woman froze, her gaze snapping to Sarah. For a moment her flickering form steadied, and a flicker of humanity returned to her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by cold fury. You dare speak my name, she hissed. Do you think it gives you power over me? Emily stepped forward, clutching the journal. We're trying to understand. If you tell us what happened, maybe we can help. Help? Miriam's laugh was bitter, laced with venom. You can't help. You can't undo what they did to me, and now you'll pay the price for their sins. We're not them, Dylan shouted. We didn't do anything to you. Miriam's form grew darker, her voice rising with anger. You set foot on their land. You carry their blood. You are no different. The shadows in the church thickened, crawling along the walls and floor like living things. The air grew heavier, pressing down on them with suffocating force. We're sorry, Sarah cried, clutching the journal to her chest. We didn't know. Please tell us how to make this right. For a moment the pressure eased. Miriam's figure stilled, her eyes narrowing as she studied them. There is no making it right, she said coldly. But there is a way to end it, if you truly wish to leave. Emily hesitated. What do we have to do? Miriam's smile was cruel, her voice like ice. Bring me what I was denied. Justice. Bring me the blood of the living, and I will release you. No, Sarah shouted, shaking her head. We can't do that. There has to be another way. Miriam's face twisted in fury, and the shadows surged toward them like a tidal wave. Then you will stay here, forever. Wait! Dylan yelled, holding up his hands. You said they wronged you. Who are they? The townspeople, the ones who killed you. Miriam paused, her form wavering. They betrayed me, she whispered, her voice tinged with something almost human. They feared what they could not understand. They blamed me for their misfortunes, their failures. They bound me and burned me. screaming my name as if it were a curse. The flickering candle on the altar flared brightly, casting eerie shadows across Miriam's face. Their screams were my last memory, and so I made sure they would never forget mine. The group exchanged uneasy glances. "You cursed them," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Miriam's cruel smile returned. "I condemned them to the suffering they inflicted on me. They and their descendants. All who walk these lands are mine." "But we're not their descendants," Dylan argued. "We're not part of this town or its history." "Yet here you are," Miriam said darkly. "You entered willingly, and now you belong to me." Emily's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of Miriam's story. What if we could break the curse? What if we could free you? Miriam's laughter echoed through the church again, cold and bitter. "You think I want freedom? I have everything I need. Power, revenge, and you." She stepped closer, her form growing darker. "Will serve as my next vessels of wrath." The group stepped back instinctively, fear clawing at their throats. "But what if we could bring you peace?" Emily pressed, her voice rising with desperation. "Wouldn't you want to rest? To finally let go of all this pain?" For a fleeting moment, Miriam's form faltered and her voice softened. "Peace," she whispered, as though tasting the word. But then her eyes darkened and her figure solidified. "There is no peace for me, only vengeance." The shadows surged again, swallowing the light from the windows and extinguishing the candle on the altar. The church plunged into darkness, and Miriam's voice boomed, more monstrous than ever. "Your time is up." Suddenly, the floor beneath them groaned and cracked, splitting apart as tendrils of shadow snaked toward them. The group scattered, scrambling to avoid the jagged fissures that opened beneath their feet. "Run!" Dylan shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward the door. Emily followed, clutching the journal tightly as they fled the collapsing church. Miriam's laughter echoed behind them, growing louder as the walls began to crumble. They burst through the door and into the open air, gasping for breath. The town around them was shrouded in an unnatural fog, the buildings distorted and shifting as though alive. "What do we do now?" Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. Emily held up the journal, her hands shaking. "We find another way. We'll figure it out." Dylan looked back at the church, now half consumed by shadows. "We'd better figure it out fast." From within the fog, Miriam's voice rang out, cold and taunting. "You can't escape me. You'll never leave Black Hollow." The fog enveloping Black Hollow thickened, muffling their footsteps and distorting the shapes of the crumbling buildings around them. Emily clutched the journal tightly to her chest as they ran, her mind racing to piece together the fragmented story within its pages. "We need to get out of here," Sarah panted, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "She's toying with us." Emily stopped suddenly, turning to face them. "We can't leave. Not yet." "What?" Dylan asked, doubling over to catch his breath. "Didn't you hear her? She's not letting us go." "But this journal might be the key," Emily said, holding it up. "There's something in here, something about her curse. If we can figure it out, maybe we can stop her." "Or maybe we're just wasting time," Dylan snapped. "You heard her. She doesn't want peace. She wants blood." "That's not true," Emily argued, her voice rising. "When I said the word peace," she hesitated. For a moment, she faltered. "That means there's still a chance to reason with her." "Reason with her?" Sarah said incredulously. "She's trying to kill us, Emily." "She's not trying to kill us," Emily insisted. "She's trying to make us suffer. It's part of the curse, revenge for what happened to her. But if we can find out how it started, maybe we can end it." Dylan rubbed his temples, frustration evident on his face. "Fine. Let's say you're right. What are we supposed to do? Dig through every building in this creepy-ass town looking for clues? Emily glanced down at the journal, flipping through its brittle pages. The church wasn't the only place she mentioned. She said they burned her, right? There must be some kind of execution site. Maybe it's there. And then what? Sarah asked, crossing her arms. What if we find it, and it just makes her stronger? Emily hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on her. I don't know, she admitted, but it's the only lead we have. Dylan sighed, looking around at the swirling fog. Fine, let's find this execution site, but if it feels like we're walking into a trap, we're out. Sarah reluctantly nodded, and the three of them set off, moving cautiously through the abandoned streets of Black Hollow. The town seemed to twist and shift as they walked, the buildings looming unnaturally tall and casting distorted shadows across the ground. The air was heavy, thick with the metallic tang of something unnameable. The fog obscured their path, and every sound, every creak of wood, every distant whisper set their nerves on edge. Emily consulted the map they'd found in the car earlier, tracing her finger over the faded ink. There's an open area just beyond the town square, she said. It might be the spot. Dylan frowned. If this place even has a square, it's more like a nightmare maze. They pressed on, the streets narrowing until they emerged into a clearing at the center of the town. The space was eerily empty, save for a single tree in the middle, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like twisted claws. Beneath it stood a stone platform, blackened and cracked as if scorched by fire. This must be it, Emily whispered, stepping forward. The closer they got, the more oppressive the air became. Sarah's breath quickened, and she clutched Dylan's arm. I don't like this, she murmured. Emily knelt by the stone, running her fingers over its rough surface. Faint symbols were etched into the rock, worn by time but still faintly visible. These markings, they're not just random, they're runes. It looks like some kind of binding spell. Binding spell? Dylan asked, his brow furrowing. What does that mean? It means they didn't just kill her, Emily replied, her voice grim. They tried to bind her soul here, to trap her. Why would they do that? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Emily looked up, her expression dark. Because they were afraid of her. Dylan frowned, crossing his arms. Afraid of what? She said they accused her of witchcraft. Was it real, or were they just looking for a scapegoat? Maybe both, Emily said, standing. If she really cursed them with her dying breath, then she had power, and they knew it. So what do we do? Dylan asked. If she's bound here, how do we unbind her? Emily opened the journal again, scanning the pages. Her eyes widened as she found an entry detailing the execution. It says here that the curse was sealed with her blood. They used it to bind her to the land. If we can find her remains, maybe we can break the seal. Her remains, Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. You mean her bones? They're still here. Emily nodded. They'd have to be. If they burned her on this platform, her ashes might still be buried nearby. Dylan looked around uneasily. This is starting to sound like a terrible idea. Do you have a better one? Emily shot back. He didn't. They searched the area around the tree, using sticks and their bare hands to dig into the earth. The fog seemed to press closer, as if watching their every move. After what felt like hours, Sarah let out a startled gasp. I found something. The others rushed to her side as she pulled a charred bone from the soil. It was small and brittle, but unmistakably human. This has to be hers, Sarah said, her voice shaking. Emily carefully took the bone, her fingers trembling. We need to burn it, she said. If we destroy what's left of her physical form, it might sever her connection to this place. "Are you sure about this?" Dylan asked, his voice heavy with doubt. "No," Emily admitted, "but we don't have a choice." They gathered a pile of dry wood from the nearby ruins, building a makeshift pyre on the blackened platform. Emily placed the bone on top, her heart pounding as she lit a match and held it to the wood. The flames caught quickly, consuming the wood and climbing toward the bone. As the fire roared to life, a piercing scream echoed through the clearing, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. "She knows," Sarah whispered, clutching Dylan's arm. The fog thickened, swirling violently around them as the scream grew louder. The flames turned black, writhing like living things, and Miriam's figure appeared in the center of the clearing, her eyes blazing with fury. "You dare!" she roared, her voice shaking the air. "You think you can unmake me?" The group backed away, fear gripping them as the shadows surged toward them. Emily grabbed Sarah's hand, her voice breaking. "We have to finish this!" But before they could react, the black flames exploded outward, consuming the clearing in darkness. Miriam's laughter echoed in their ears, cold and triumphant. "You will pay for this!" The explosion of darkness engulfed everything. Emily, Sarah, and Dylan screamed as they were thrown to the ground, their ears ringing from the force of the blast. The black fog clung to them, heavy and suffocating, like it had its own malevolent will. "Get up!" Dylan shouted, his voice muffled by the oppressive darkness. He reached for Emily, pulling her to her feet. "We can't stay here!" Sarah scrambled to her knees, coughing as the acrid smoke filled her lungs. "Where do we go? We can't even see." "Anywhere but here!" Dylan yelled, dragging both Emily and Sarah toward what he hoped was the edge of the clearing. The fog moved with them, twisting and swirling like it was alive. The faint outlines of the town's buildings loomed in the distance, but they warped and shifted as though taunting them. Miriam's voice rang out, cold and triumphant. "You cannot escape me. Your blood will seal my power." "Run!" Emily screamed, yanking Sarah's arm as they stumbled forward. The ground felt uneven, as if the earth itself was trying to trap them. Each step was a battle against the weight of the darkness pressing down on them. The laughter grew louder, echoing from every direction. Then, without warning, a shadowy figure materialized in front of them. Miriam's form, her tattered dress billowing as if caught in an unseen wind. Her eyes burned like coals, and her mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "You think you can destroy me," she hissed. "You are nothing, just like the rest." "Leave us alone," Dylan shouted, stepping in front of the others. His voice was steady, but his legs shook with fear. Miriam tilted her head, regarding him with mock curiosity. Such bravery, for one so fragile. Her hand shot forward, and Dylan was lifted off the ground, his body writhing as if an invisible force were crushing him. "No!" Emily screamed, running toward him, but she was stopped by an unseen barrier. She pounded on it, tears streaming down her face. "Let him go!" Miriam's laughter was sharp and cold. "You're all the same, weak, desperate, clinging to hope where there is none." Dylan's screams filled the air as he was flung backward, landing hard on the ground. He groaned, clutching his chest, but managed to crawl toward Emily and Sarah. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking as she helped him to his feet. "I'm fine," Dylan gasped, though his face was pale and he could barely stand. Miriam floated closer, her form darkening, her voice reverberating through the clearing. "I will devour you, just as I did the others. Your suffering will feed my power." "Not if we stop you first," Emily said, her voice trembling but defiant. She clutched the journal tightly, flipping through its pages. Her fingers stopped on an entry describing the ritual that had bound Miriam to the land. "This is how they trapped you," Emily said, holding up the journal. "They used your blood to seal the curse, but we can break it. We'll sever your tie to this place." Miriam's eyes narrowed, and her form flickered. as though the very mention of the ritual weakened her, but her smile returned, colder than before. You think you can wield the same power they did? You are fools. We don't need power, Emily said, her voice steady now. We just need to undo what they did. Sarah stepped closer, her voice filled with determination. You were wronged, Miriam. We get that. But taking revenge on innocent people won't change what happened to you. It won't bring you peace. Miriam's form wavered, her expression unreadable. Peace, she whispered, almost as if the word pained her. But then her eyes darkened again, and she snarled, There is no peace. Only vengeance. The fog surged toward them, tendrils of darkness reaching for their throats. Emily grabbed Dylan and Sarah, pulling them back. We have to finish this now. But how? Sarah cried. What do we do? Emily flipped through the journal frantically, her eyes scanning the hastily scrawled notes. The fire didn't work because we didn't use the right ingredients. The ritual that bound her. She pointed to a passage. It used her blood, but it also used salt and silver. That's how they kept her tied to this place. We don't have any of that, Dylan shouted, dodging a shadowy tendril that lashed out at him. Salt we can find, Emily said, her mind racing. There's probably some left in one of the old houses. And the silver, we just need something coated in it, like cutlery or jewelry. Where do we even look? Sarah asked, her voice rising in panic. Emily turned, her gaze locking onto one of the larger buildings at the edge of the clearing. It was an old boarding house, its windows shattered and its roof sagging. There, it's our best bet. The three of them sprinted toward the building, the fog snapping at their heels. Miriam's voice followed them, cold and relentless. You can't hide. I will find you. The boarding house was even more decrepit inside than it appeared from the outside. The floorboards creaked dangerously under their weight, and the air was thick with dust. The furniture was overturned and decayed, and cobwebs hung in every corner. Split up, Emily said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. We don't have much time. Look for anything that might help. Sarah hesitated, glancing nervously toward the darkened hallways. I don't think splitting up is a good idea. Just stay within shouting distance, Dylan said, his voice tight. We can cover more ground this way. Reluctantly, they each took a section of the house. Emily scoured the kitchen, opening cabinets and drawers. She let out a small gasp of relief when she found a tin of salt, its label faded but intact. Got salt, she called, her voice echoing through the house. Dylan rummaged through a drawer in what looked like a former dining room. His hand brushed against something cold and metallic, and he pulled out a tarnished silver spoon. Silverware! Found it. Good, Emily said, meeting him in the hall. Now we just need a place to do the ritual. Before Dylan could respond, Sarah's scream pierced the air. They bolted toward the sound, finding her in a bedroom at the far end of the hall. She was standing frozen, her flashlight trembling in her hand as she pointed it at the far corner of the room. Miriam stood there, her figure flickering and distorted, her eyes burning with fury. You cannot stop me, she growled. You are mine. Emily stepped in front of Sarah, clutching the journal like a shield. We're not yours, she said, her voice steady. Not anymore. Miriam's form surged forward, and the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, spiraling toward them like a vortex. Emily's grip on the journal tightened as she shouted, Get to the clearing. We'll end this now. The group bolted from the boarding house, clutching the salt, the silver spoon, and the journal. The shadows clawed at their heels, driven by Miriam's relentless fury. Her laughter echoed through the fog, taunting them with every step. You cannot run, her voice boomed, cutting through the eerie silence. You will fail, as all before you have failed. Emily's lungs burned as she sprinted toward the clearing, where the gnarled tree and the blackened stone platform waited. The journal pressed tightly against her chest, its brittle pages holding their fragile hope for survival. "Get the salt ready," she yelled over her shoulder. "We'll need to form a circle around the platform." Dylan fumbled with the tin of salt, nearly dropping it as they skidded to a stop in the clearing. "Here," he said, thrusting it toward Emily. The air around them was colder now, the fog thicker and heavier than before. The blackened tree loomed above them, its twisted branches like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. Miriam's presence was everywhere, her shadowy form flickering in and out of the corners of their vision. "We don't have much time," Emily shouted, pouring a line of salt around the stone platform. "This will protect us while we perform the ritual." Sarah knelt beside her, helping to complete the circle. Her hands trembled, but she worked quickly, desperate to finish before Miriam could strike again. Dylan stood guard, the silver spoon clutched tightly in his hand like a weapon. "Emily," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "What if this doesn't work?" "It has to," Emily said, her voice firm. "It's the only chance we have." Miriam's figure materialized at the edge of the clearing, her eyes burning like coals. Her form was larger now, more monstrous, her tattered dress flowing like liquid shadow. "You think this will save you?" she hissed. "You think you can break my chains?" "We're going to try," Emily yelled, stepping onto the platform with the journal. Miriam's laughter was sharp and cruel. "Then prepare to suffer." The shadows surged toward the clearing, slamming against the salt circle like a tidal wave. The ground trembled under the force, and the air filled with a low, bone-chilling hum. The salt held, but barely. Thin cracks appeared in the line as the darkness pushed against it. "Start the ritual!" Dylan shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar. Emily opened the journal, flipping to the page with the ritual's instructions. Her eyes scanned the faded ink, her heart pounding. "We need her blood," she said, her voice faltering. "What?" Sarah cried. "How are we supposed to get that?" Emily held up the charred bone fragment they'd found earlier. "Her blood is in this. It's all that's left of her physical form. We just need to burn it with the silver and salt." "Do it!" Dylan yelled, stepping back as the shadows clawed at the circle, their whispers growing louder and more frantic. Emily placed the bone fragment in the center of the platform, then sprinkled salt over it. She handed the silver spoon to Sarah. "Hold this over the fire once it's lit. The silver needs to melt into the ashes." Sarah hesitated, fear written across her face. "What if it doesn't work?" "It will," Emily said firmly, striking a match and holding it to the kindling they'd placed on the platform. The flames caught quickly, their warm light a stark contrast to the icy darkness surrounding them. Miriam shrieked, her form flickering violently as the fire consumed the bone. The shadows recoiled, writhing as though in pain. "No!" she screamed, her voice filled with rage and desperation. "You will not break me." "Keep going!" Dylan shouted, throwing another handful of salt onto the fire as Sarah held the silver spoon over the flames. The metal began to melt, dripping onto the bone and mingling with the ashes. The journal trembled in Emily's hands, its pages flipping wildly as though possessed. Words appeared on the blank spaces, scrawled in jagged black ink. "Speak the binding words." Emily's voice shook as she read aloud, the ancient syllables foreign and harsh. The air around them grew heavier with each word, the shadows convulsing violently against the salt circle. Miriam's form surged forward, slamming into the barrier with enough force to send cracks spiderwebbing through the ground. Her voice was no longer human, but a guttural roar that shook the trees. "You cannot take this from me!" Emily didn't stop. She recited the final lines of the ritual, her voice rising above the chaos. "By this fire, by this salt, by this silver, your ties to this land are severed. Be gone." The fire blazed brighter, and the shadows screamed as they were drawn into the flames. Miriam's form writhed, her figure collapsing in on itself like a dying star. Her screams echoed through the clearing, filled with rage, despair, and something that sounded almost like sorrow. "Is it working?" Sarah cried, shielding her face from the blinding light. "I think so," Dylan shouted, watching as the darkness began to dissolve, retreating into the earth. Miriam's voice cut through the air one last time, low and venomous. "This is not the end. You will never escape the mark I've left upon you." With that, her form shattered into 1,000 pieces, dissipating into the night. The fire burned low, and the oppressive fog began to lift. The clearing was silent, save for the crackling of the dying flames. The group stood in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Emily dropped the journal, her hands trembling. "Is it over?" Dylan stared at the charred remains on the platform. "I think so." Sarah sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she whispered. "We're free." But even as they embraced, relief washing over them, a cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a faint whisper. "This is not over." The three of them exchanged uneasy glances, their victory tinged with the lingering fear that Miriam's curse might not be so easily undone. The clearing lay quiet in the aftermath of the ritual. The charred remains of the fire smoldered, faint wisps of smoke curling into the night air. For the first time since they had arrived in Black Hollow, the oppressive fog had lifted, revealing a sky studded with stars. The group stood motionless, their breaths visible in the crisp air. "Do you feel that?" Sarah whispered, breaking the silence. "What?" Dylan asked, his voice hoarse. Sarah looked around, her expression uncertain. "It feels lighter, like the air isn't pressing down on us anymore." Emily nodded slowly, the exhaustion evident in her face. "Maybe we really did it. Maybe we broke her hold." Dylan didn't answer. He stood at the edge of the platform, staring at the blackened ground where Miriam had been consumed by the ritual. His hands were balled into fists, and his jaw was tight. "Dylan?" Emily prompted. "What is it?" He turned to face her, his eyes dark with lingering unease. "What if we didn't destroy her? What if we just pushed her back?" Sarah frowned, wrapping her arms around herself. "But she's gone. You saw her. She shattered or disintegrated, or whatever that was." "Yeah," Dylan said, his tone sharp. "But did you hear what she said? She told us this wasn't over. What if she meant it?" "She was trying to scare us," Emily argued, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's what she does. We completed the ritual. It worked." "Did it?" Dylan shot back. "Because if it didn't, then she's still out there, waiting for her chance." "Stop," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Please, I can't handle the idea that this might not be over. We have to believe we ended it." Emily placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, her touch steadying. "Sarah's right. We can't keep second-guessing ourselves. We did everything the ritual asked for. Miriam's connection to this place should be severed." Dylan let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. I need to see proof. I need to know she's really gone." Emily glanced at the journal, now lying on the ground beside the platform. Its pages were still and silent, the scrawled words that had guided the ritual no longer moving. "The journal hasn't changed," she said. "That has to mean something. Or it means we're just out of options," Dylan muttered. "Stop it," Sarah snapped, her voice uncharacteristically sharp. "Please, just stop. I can't take any more of this doubt. If we let this fear control us, then she still wins." Dylan fell silent, his eyes softening as he looked at Sarah. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I don't want us to let our guard down and pay for it later." Emily nodded, her expression serious. "I get it. But right now, we need to focus on getting out of here. If we've broken her curse, we should be able to leave Black Hollow for good." The mention of leaving seemed to lift the group's spirits slightly. They gathered their belongings, moving quickly and deliberately. The night was still eerily quiet, but the oppressive weight that had hung over the town was noticeably absent. "Let's get to the car," Emily said, leading the way. "If we can leave, we'll know for sure that the curse is broken." The walk back to the car was nerve-wracking. Every creak of wood and rustle of leaves made them jump, their nerves frayed from days of fear. The buildings of Black Hollow loomed around them, silent witnesses to their ordeal. When they reached the car, it was still parked where Nathan had left it. Emily's chest tightened at the sight, the memory of his departure fresh in her mind. "Do you think he made it out?" she asked softly. Dylan didn't answer, his jaw tightening. Sarah shook her head, her expression sorrowful. "I hope so," she said, "but if he didn't, I don't think we'll ever know." Emily slid into the driver's seat, her hands trembling as she turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and a collective sigh of relief filled the car. "It works," Dylan said, his voice tinged with surprise. "That's a good sign, right?" "Let's not question it," Emily replied, her grip on the wheel tightening. "Let's just get out of here." She pulled onto the narrow dirt road that led away from the town, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The trees pressed in on either side, their skeletal branches reaching toward the car, like the claws of some unseen predator. For a while, no one spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. The tension in the car was palpable, each of them lost in their own thoughts. But as they drove, a faint sound began to creep into their awareness, a low, rhythmic thumping, like the distant beat of a drum. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily frowned, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "What is that?" The sound grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. It wasn't a drum, it was footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, echoing from somewhere behind them. "She's gone," Dylan said firmly, though his voice betrayed his fear. "We ended it." "Then what's making that noise?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with panic. Emily pressed the accelerator, the car speeding up as the footsteps seemed to match their pace. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white. "We're almost out of the forest," she said, as much to herself as to the others. "Just hold on." The trees began to thin, the road straightening as they neared the edge of the forest. The footsteps faded, replaced by an unsettling silence that seemed even more ominous. "We're clear," Dylan said, exhaling deeply as they emerged onto the main road. "We made it." But just as relief began to wash over them, Emily slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. Standing in the middle of the road was a figure in tattered clothes, their face hidden in shadow. "No!" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "No, no, no!" The figure stepped closer and the headlights illuminated its face. It wasn't Miriam. It was Nathan. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale and lifeless. He raised a hand pointing directly at them, his lips moving soundlessly. Then, with a sudden, jerking motion, his head snapped upward and he let out a blood-curdling scream. The shadows surged from the forest, swallowing him whole. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The echo of Nathan's scream lingered in the car, an unnatural, bone-chilling sound that made her entire body tremble. Dylan leaned forward, his face pale as he stared at the spot where Nathan had stood seconds earlier. He's gone," Sarah stammered, tears streaming down her face. "What happened to him? What was that?" The group sat in stunned silence, the darkness pressing in on them. The forest seemed alive again, its shadows twisting and reaching toward the car. Emily snapped out of her shock, slamming the car into gear. "We're not staying to find out. Hold on!" The tires screeched as the car sped forward, the headlights slicing through the inky blackness. The road stretched ahead of them like a lifeline, but it felt like it would never end. Emily's heart raced as she pushed the car faster, the sound of the engine roaring in her ears. "Did you see his eyes?" Dylan asked, his voice shaking. They were empty, like he wasn't even there anymore. "It wasn't him," Emily said firmly, though her voice betrayed her fear. "It couldn't have been him." "It was him," Sarah whispered, clutching her knees to her chest. "It was Nathan, but he wasn't alive." Dylan turned to her, his expression grim. "You think Miriam got to him?" "She said we were marked," Sarah replied, her voice cracking. Maybe he couldn't escape it." Emily's stomach churned at the thought. "We broke the curse," she said, her voice rising in desperation. "We did everything the ritual asked for. She shouldn't still have any power." "Then why is she still here?" Dylan shot back. "Why is Nathan out there screaming like that?" Emily didn't answer. Her hands tightened on the wheel, her mind racing. The journal had promised them a way to sever Miriam's connection, to destroy her hold over Black Hollow. But now, doubt gnawed at her resolve. What if they had misunderstood? What if they had failed? They drove for what felt like hours, the oppressive darkness refusing to give way to the faintest glimmer of dawn. The car's headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the trees seemed to stretch endlessly on either side, trapping them in an eternal night. "I don't understand," Emily muttered, her voice breaking the tense silence. "We should have reached the main highway by now." "We're going in circles," Dylan said grimly. "Look at the trees. They're the same ones we passed when we entered Black Hollow." "That's impossible," Emily replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "We've been driving straight the whole time." "Then why aren't we out of the forest?" Dylan shot back. Sarah's breathing quickened, panic setting in. "We're still trapped. We didn't break the curse. She's keeping us here." "No," Emily said firmly, shaking her head. "No, that's not true. We're just disoriented. We'll find the way out." But even as she said the words, a knot of fear twisted in her chest. The air in the car was heavy, suffocating, as though the shadows outside were pressing against the windows, trying to seep inside. Suddenly, the car's headlights flickered, plunging them into darkness for a brief, terrifying moment. The engine sputtered, and the car jerked violently before the lights came back on. "What the hell was that?" Dylan yelled, gripping the dashboard. Emily didn't answer, her eyes scanning the road frantically. The car shuddered again, and the headlights dimmed. This time, the darkness outside seemed thicker, more oppressive, and in the faint glow of the faltering lights, they saw her. Miriam stood in the center of the road, her figure impossibly tall and shrouded in swirling shadows. Her eyes burned like embers, and her voice rang out, cold and commanding. "You thought you could escape me?" "Drive!" Dylan shouted, but Emily's hands froze on the wheel. Miriam raised a hand, and the shadows surged forward, slamming into the car like a tidal wave. The vehicle rocked violently, the windows rattling as the darkness seeped inside. The air grew icy, their breaths visible as the temperature plummeted. "Get out of the car!" Dylan yelled, throwing open the door. "No!" Emily screamed. "Stay together! She'll pick us off one by one if we split up." But it was too late. Dylan was already outside, stumbling into the swirling fog. Sarah followed him, her panicked cries barely audible over the howling wind. Emily hesitated, fear rooting her to the driver's seat, but the car rocked again, and the windshield cracked under the pressure. With a cry of frustration, she grabbed the journal and scrambled out of the car. The moment her feet hit the ground, The cold bit into her skin like knives. The shadows twisted and writhed around them, obscuring the road and the trees. "Dylan! Sarah!" Emily shouted, her voice hoarse. "Over here!" Dylan's voice called, distant and muffled. Emily stumbled toward the sound, clutching the journal tightly. The shadows seemed to part just enough to reveal Dylan and Sarah standing together, their backs pressed against a tree. Their eyes were wide with fear as they stared at something behind her. Emily turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Miriam stood only a few feet away, her form towering over them. Her dress billowed like smoke, and her eyes glowed with a malevolent light. "You cannot run," Miriam said, her voice soft but filled with malice. "This land is mine, and so are you." Emily stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. "You don't have any power over us anymore. We completed the ritual. Your curse is broken." Miriam tilted her head, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "Did you really think it would be that easy? My blood may no longer bind me to this place, but your fear, your suffering, that is my true power." Dylan clenched his fists. "We're not afraid of you." Miriam's laughter echoed through the darkness, cold and mocking. "Aren't you? I can taste your fear. It clings to you like a shadow." Emily's mind raced as she clutched the journal. The ritual had weakened her, but it hadn't destroyed her. There had to be something they'd missed, some way to end this once and for all. "What do you want from us?" Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. "Why won't you let us go?" Miriam's gaze shifted to Sarah, and her expression softened, almost pitying. "Because I was never given the chance to leave," she said, her voice filled with a sorrow that cut through the group like a blade. "This place became my prison, and now it is yours." The shadows surged forward again, swallowing the light as Miriam raised her arms. Emily, Dylan and Sarah huddled together, the icy tendrils clawing at their skin. Emily opened the journal, her fingers trembling as she flipped through its pages. If the ritual had failed, there had to be another way, a final step they hadn't taken. And then she saw it. A single word scrawled at the bottom of the last page, faint but clear. Sacrifice. Her blood ran cold as the meaning sunk in. Someone had to stay behind. Someone had to become the anchor that Miriam would never release. "No," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "There has to be another way." But as the shadows closed in, she realized there might not be. Emily's breath hitched as she stared at the single damning word etched into the journal. Sacrifice. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, a cruel and unavoidable truth. For Miriam to be stopped, someone had to take her place, a living anchor to bind her fury. "What is it?" Dylan asked, his voice trembling as he saw the pale look on Emily's face. She closed the journal, holding it tightly against her chest as she turned to face him and Sarah. "The curse isn't broken," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ritual weakened her, but it didn't destroy her. It can't, not entirely." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "What are you saying?" Emily hesitated, her throat tightening. "Someone has to stay. That's the only way to end this. Miriam's curse needs a tether. If we don't give her one, she'll keep coming after us, and after anyone else who comes here." Dylan's face darkened as the weight of her words sank in. No, we're not doing that. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Emily said, her voice cracking. "This is how they trapped her the first time. They used her blood, her essence, to tie her to the land. But now, it has to be one of us." Sarah shook her head violently, backing away. "No, that's insane. We came here together. We're leaving together." "Miriam won't let us leave," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Not all of us." Dylan turned toward the swirling shadows that surrounded them, his hands clenched into fists. This is her game. She's trying to divide us, to make us turn on each other. We're not playing by her rules. She's not lying. Miriam's voice cut through the air, cold and mocking. Her shadowy form materialized a few feet away, towering over them. The girl is right. One must stay, or none will leave. "You're lying!" Dylan shouted, his voice raw with anger. "You're trying to trap us, like you did with Nathan." Miriam's expression twisted into a cruel smile. "Nathan's fate was sealed the moment he abandoned you. He thought he could run, but this place does not forgive cowardice." Sarah sobbed, shaking her head. "This can't be happening. This isn't fair." "Fair?" Miriam's voice was venomous, her form flickering with rage. "Was it fair when they dragged me to this place? When they bound me to the flames? When they cursed me to an eternity of suffering?" Her voice rose to a deafening roar, the shadows surging around her like a storm. "Fairness is an illusion, and you will find no justice here." Emily stepped forward, her heart pounding. She didn't want to believe it, but she knew Miriam was telling the truth. Someone had to stay behind. The curse demanded a tether. She turned to Dylan and Sarah, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do it." "No!" Dylan shouted, grabbing her arm. "You're not doing this. We'll find another way." "There is no other way," Emily said, her voice breaking. "You know that as well as I do. If we try to run, she'll follow us. She'll hunt us until there's nothing left." Sarah clung to her, sobbing. "You can't do this. Please, Emily. We can figure this out together." Emily pulled Sarah into a tight embrace, her heart breaking at the sound of her friend's cries. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "but this is the only way to keep you safe." Dylan shook his head, his eyes blazing with anger and despair. If anyone's staying, it's me." Emily turned to him, her voice firm. "No, Dylan, you and Sarah have a better chance of making it out of here together. You have to take care of each other, please." Miriam watched the exchange with an eerie calm, her shadowy form hovering like a vulture. "The choice is yours," she said, her voice cold, "but choose quickly. The longer you delay, the more I hunger." Dylan stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You don't get to win," he snarled at Miriam. "You don't get to take her." Miriam tilted her head, her smile widening. "Bravery is admirable, but useless." "Enough!" Emily shouted, turning to face Miriam. "If I stay, will you let them go?" Miriam's eyes glowed, her voice soft but deadly. "They will be free, but you will be mine." "Emily, no!" Sarah cried, grabbing her arm. "Please don't do this." Emily gently pushed her away, her heart shattering at the sight of Sarah's tear-streaked face. "You have to go," she said. "Get out of here. Live your lives. Don't let this place take everything from us." Dylan grabbed her hand, his voice breaking. "This isn't fair. You don't deserve this." "None of us do," Emily said, forcing a sad smile. "But someone has to stop her." With that, Emily stepped forward, crossing the broken salt circle to stand before Miriam. The shadows wrapped around her like tendrils, pulling her closer. "Emily!" Sarah screamed, trying to run after her, but Dylan held her back. "Don't! Please!" Emily turned one last time, her eyes filled with tears. "Go," she said softly, "before it's too late." Miriam's laughter filled the air as the shadows consumed Emily, her figure disappearing into the swirling darkness. The ground trembled, and a deafening roar echoed through the forest as the shadows exploded outward, dissipating into the night. And then there was silence. Dylan and Sarah stood in stunned disbelief, the clearing now eerily calm. The fog had lifted completely, revealing the sky bathed in the faint glow of dawn. The oppressive weight that had haunted them since they arrived in Black Hollow was gone. "She's gone," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Emily's gone." Dylan stared at the spot where Emily had vanished, his fists clenched and tears streaming down his face. "She saved us," he said hoarsely. "She gave up everything to stop her." The two of them stood there for a long moment, the reality of what had happened sinking in. Finally, Dylan took Sarah's hand, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "We need to go. We owe her that much." Sarah nodded, wiping her tears as they turned and walked away from the clearing. The road stretched out before them, clear and open, leading them away from Black Hollow. But even as they left, a faint whisper lingered in the air. "This is not over." Dylan and Sarah drove in silence, the road stretching endlessly before them. The first light of dawn broke through the dense canopy of trees, casting weak, dappled rays across the hood of the car. The oppressive darkness of Black Hollow was behind them now, but its presence lingered in their minds like a shadow that refused to fade. Sarah sat curled up in the passenger seat, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her eyes were red from crying, and her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. She stared out the window, but she wasn't looking at the passing trees. She was seeing Emily, her best friend, standing in the clearing, vanishing into the swirling shadows. "She didn't have to do it," Sarah whispered finally, breaking the heavy silence. Dylan's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "She thought it was the only way," he said, his voice rough. "And maybe it was." "It's not fair," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "She was so brave, and now she's gone, and we just left her there." Dylan exhaled shakily, his gaze fixed on the road. "She didn't give us a choice, Sarah. She wanted us to leave. She wanted us to live." "Live?" Sarah snapped, turning to him with tears streaming down her face. "How are we supposed to live with this, knowing we left her behind, knowing she's trapped with that thing?" Dylan didn't answer. He couldn't. The guilt clawed at him, an unrelenting weight on his chest. Emily's sacrifice had saved them, but at what cost? She was gone, and they were free, at least for now. They drove for hours, the road eventually giving way to open fields and the first signs of civilization. The tension in the car eased slightly as they passed a weathered road sign welcoming them to the next town. "Should we tell someone?" Sarah asked hesitantly. "About Black Hollow, about what happened?" Dylan shook his head. "And say what? That we were cursed by a ghost? That Emily sacrificed herself to save us? No one would believe us." "But someone has to know," Sarah insisted. "What if someone else goes there? What if it starts all over again?" Dylan hesitated, his mind racing. Sarah was right. Black Hollow wasn't just going to vanish. Miriam's presence might have been weakened, but she wasn't truly gone. Emily's sacrifice had bound her to the land again, but it wasn't permanent. It couldn't be. "Let's just get some rest," Dylan said finally. "We can figure out what to do after that." They found a small motel on the outskirts of the town, its neon sign flickering weakly in the early morning light. The clerk behind the desk didn't ask questions as Dylan paid for a room, and soon they were inside, the heavy motel door shutting out the world. Sarah collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. Dylan sat in the worn armchair by the window, staring out at the parking lot. The hum of a vending machine in the hallway was the only sound. "I can't stop hearing her voice," Sarah said quietly. "When she said, 'Go,' it's like it's burned into my mind." Dylan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Me too. She knew what she was doing. She wanted us to get out." "But what about her?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "What's going to happen to her? Is she gone? Or is she trapped?" Dylan finished, his voice hollow. "Just like Miriam was. Emily is the tether now." The room fell silent again, the weight of the truth pressing down on them. That night Sarah woke with a start. Her chest heaved, her breath coming in short gasps as she tried to shake off the remnants of a nightmare. In her dream, she had been back in Black Hollow, standing in the clearing. The shadows had surrounded her, and Miriam's voice had echoed in her ears, repeating the same chilling phrase, "This is not over." She sat up, her hands shaking, and glanced around the dimly lit motel room. Dylan was asleep in the chair by the window, his head tilted back and his arms crossed. The journal lay on the small table beside him, its cover slightly ajar. Sarah frowned, leaning over to pick it up. She hadn't realized Dylan had brought it with them. As she opened the journal, the brittle pages crinkled under her fingers. The words were the same as before, detailed notes about the curse, the ritual, and the horrors of Black Hollow. But as she flipped to the final page, she froze. A new line had appeared, scrawled in jagged black ink. "You cannot run from the darkness. It will find you." Her breath caught in her throat as the ink on the page began to shift and writhe, the letters twisting into an all-too-familiar shape. Miriam's face appeared on the paper, her hollow eyes staring directly at Sarah. Sarah screamed, dropping the journal. Dylan jolted awake, his eyes darting around the room. "What? What happened?" Sarah pointed to the journal, her hand trembling. It's her. She's still here." Dylan grabbed the journal, flipping through its pages, but the new writing and Miriam's face were gone. The pages were blank, as if nothing had changed. "I swear it was there," Sarah insisted, tears streaming down her face. "She was staring at me." Dylan rubbed his temples, his exhaustion evident. "Sarah, don't say I'm imagining it," she snapped, cutting him off. "I know what I saw." Dylan sighed, placing the journal on the table. "I'm not saying you're imagining it. I'm saying this isn't over. Whatever we did back there, it wasn't enough." Sarah's eyes filled with fear. "Then what do we do?" Dylan didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, his jaw tightening. "We have to figure out how to end it for good," he said finally. "Not just for us, for Emily. We owe her that." "But how?" Sarah whispered. "What else is there to do?" Dylan glanced at the journal, his mind racing. "We start here. There's got to be something we missed. A way to sever the curse completely." As Sarah wiped her tears, a faint noise reached their ears, a soft rhythmic tapping on the motel window. They froze, their eyes darting to the glass. The tapping continued, deliberate and steady. Dylan stood slowly, his heart pounding, and pulled back the curtain. There was nothing there. But when he turned back to Sarah, her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed to the mirror on the far wall. In the reflection, Miriam stood behind them, her hollow eyes burning with malice. "This is not over," she whispered, her voice echoing in the small room. The motel room plunged into chaos. Sarah screamed, scrambling backward on the bed, as the reflection of Miriam in the mirror twisted and grew larger, her hollow eyes burning brighter with each passing second. Dylan spun around, his fists clenched, but there was nothing behind them, only the reflection of Miriam, looming larger and more menacing. "She's here!" Sarah cried, her voice breaking. "She followed us!" "Stay calm!" Dylan shouted, though his own fear was clear in his trembling voice. He grabbed the journal from the table, flipping through the pages frantically. "There has to be something in here, something we missed!" Miriam's voice filled the room, low and mocking. "Did you think you could escape me? You are marked, bound by the darkness you unleashed." The reflection in the mirror began to seep outward, dark tendrils of shadow spreading across the glass, like cracks in ice. The temperature in the room plummeted, frost creeping along the edges of the window and mirror. The overhead light flickered violently, casting the room into an eerie strobe of brightness and shadow. "Dylan!" Sarah yelled, clutching the blankets tightly. "What do we do? Just give me a second." Dylan snapped, scanning the journal. His eyes landed on a passage near the back of the book, one they had overlooked in the chaos of Black Hollow. The curse cannot be unbound by destruction. It can only be transferred. Transferred, Dylan whispered, his heart sinking. Miriam's laughter filled the room, echoing off the walls. "You are clever, boy," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "But cleverness will not save you." The shadows in the mirror surged forward, spilling out into the room. They writhed like living things, reaching for Dylan and Sarah. Dylan grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her off the bed. "We have to get out of here," he shouted. Sarah didn't argue. She stumbled to her feet, clutching Dylan's arm as they bolted for the door. But as Dylan reached for the handle, the shadows slammed into the door, forcing it shut. A cold wind swept through the room, carrying Miriam's voice. "You cannot run. You belong to me." The room distorted around them, the walls bending and twisting as the shadows grew thicker. Sarah clung to Dylan, her breath coming in panicked gasps. "What does she mean, transferred?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dylan flipped through the journal again, his hands shaking. "It says the curse can be transferred to someone else. That's what she's trying to do, to bind us, like she did with Emily." "But why didn't she just take us in Black Hollow?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with fear. "Because Emily sacrificed herself," Dylan said, piecing it together. "She became the anchor, but now Miriam's trying to break free again. She needs a new host, and we're her only options." Sarah's face paled. "So she's not bound to Black Hollow anymore. She's bound to us." Dylan nodded grimly. "And if we don't stop her, she'll take one of us next." "But how do we stop her?" Sarah cried. "We don't have anything left. No ritual, no fire, no silver." Dylan gritted his teeth, flipping to the passage about the curse's transfer. "It says here, if the tether willingly accepts the curse, it weakens her hold. The curse can be contained." Sarah stared at him in horror. "You mean someone has to agree to take the curse? To let her in?" "Yes," Dylan said, his voice heavy. "It's the only way to stop her from spreading it. Someone has to trap her inside themselves." "No," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We can't do that. We already lost Emily. We can't lose someone else." Dylan set the journal down, his jaw tightening. "It's the only way to end this. If one of us becomes the tether, we can keep her contained. We can stop her from hurting anyone else." Sarah shook her head violently. "No, there has to be another way." "There isn't," Dylan said firmly. He stepped closer to her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Sarah, listen to me. You've been through too much already. You don't deserve this. I'll do it." Sarah's eyes widened in panic. "No, you can't. I won't let you." "It has to be me," Dylan said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah. You can move on. You can live. But I can't let this thing destroy you." "Dylan, please," Sarah sobbed, clutching his shirt. "There has to be another way. We can fight her together. We don't have to do this." Before Dylan could respond, Miriam's laughter filled the room again. "Such noble fools," she said mockingly. "But it will not save you." The shadows surged forward, wrapping around Dylan and Sarah like icy chains. Miriam's form materialized in the center of the room, her hollow eyes blazing with malice. She extended a hand toward them, her voice low and commanding. "Choose, or I will take you both." Dylan turned to Sarah, his expression filled with both determination and sorrow. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "but this is the only way." Before Sarah could stop him, Dylan stepped forward, facing Miriam directly. "Take me," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'll be your anchor." "Dylan, no!" Sarah screamed, reaching for him, but the shadows held her back. Miriam's smile widened, and her eyes glowed brighter. "So willing," she purred. "You will make a fine vessel." The shadows surged toward Dylan, wrapping around him like a cocoon. He cried out in pain as the darkness seeped into his skin, his body convulsing. Sarah screamed, tears streaming down her face as she struggled against the shadows holding her back. "Dylan!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Don't do this!" Dylan turned to her, his face pale and his eyes filled with both pain and resolve. "It's okay," he said weakly. "You have to go. Get out of here. Don't look back." Sarah sobbed, shaking her head. "No, I won't leave you." "You have to," Dylan said, his voice fading as the shadows consumed him. "For Emily. For me." Miriam's laughter echoed one final time as Dylan's body collapsed to the floor. The shadows retreated, and the room fell deathly silent. Sarah crawled to his side, her hands trembling as she shook him. "Dylan?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, wake up." But Dylan didn't respond. His eyes were closed, his chest still. Sarah sobbed, clutching him tightly as the first rays of dawn spilled through the window. The faint light of dawn seeped through the motel window, casting long shadows across the room. Sarah knelt beside Dylan's still form, her sobs breaking the suffocating silence. Her hands trembled as she clutched his shoulders, willing him to open his eyes, to breathe, to give her any sign of life. "Dylan," she whispered, her voice raw with grief. "Please, please wake up." The room remained quiet, the air heavy with despair. The journal lay open on the floor, its brittle pages fluttering slightly as though mocking her. The final passage, the one detailing the transfer of the curse, stared back at her with cold finality. Dylan had willingly taken the curse to save her. He had sacrificed everything, just as Emily had. And now Sarah was alone. The weight of their loss crushed her, a pain so deep it felt like her heart was being torn apart. For what felt like hours, Sarah sat in silence, her tear-streaked face buried in her hands. The shadows in the room seemed less threatening now, no longer writhing with malevolent intent. But they lingered, a quiet reminder of what had transpired. As the sun rose higher, the room filled with a faint golden light. Sarah's breathing steadied, though the ache in her chest remained. She glanced down at Dylan's face, his expression peaceful, but unnervingly still. She reached out, brushing her fingers against his cheek. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I couldn't stop you. I should have done more." A faint rustling sound broke her thoughts. Sarah froze, her eyes darting to the journal on the floor. The pages began to flip on their own, faster and faster, until they stopped abruptly on a blank page near the back. Her breath caught as words appeared, scrawling themselves in jagged black ink. "The tether holds. The cycle continues." Sarah's stomach turned as the realization hit her. The curse wasn't broken. It had merely shifted, as it always had. Miriam was contained, but only for now. The journal was a record of the curse's history, and Dylan was now part of it. His sacrifice had bought her freedom, but it was temporary. The shadows would return, as they always did. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It can't end like this. There has to be a way to stop it. For good." Her hands balled into fists as a spark of determination flared within her. Emily and Dylan had given everything to save her, to keep the curse from spreading. She couldn't let their sacrifices be in vain. If there was a way to destroy the curse, to break its cycle once and for all, she had to find it. Sarah stood, her legs shaky but steady enough to carry her to the journal. She picked it up, flipping through its pages with renewed purpose. The scrawled notes, the cryptic warnings, the accounts of those who had come before, they were all pieces of a puzzle, and somewhere within them was the answer she needed. Hours later, Sarah left the motel, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. She didn't look back as she climbed into the car, her resolve hardening with every mile she drove away from the cursed town of Black Hollow. The memories of Emily and Dylan weighed heavily on her, but they also gave her strength. She would find a way to end the curse, no matter what it took. She owed them that much. As she drove, the faint sound of whispers drifted through the car, sending a chill down her spine. She glanced at the journal on the passenger seat, its cover closed but humming faintly with an unseen energy. The shadows might still linger, but Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. This wasn't the end. Not yet. She gripped the wheel tighter, her jaw set with determination. Somewhere out there, the curse could be broken. She would make sure of it. For Emily, for Dylan, for herself, and for everyone who had suffered under the weight of Black Hollow's darkness. And so, the story of Black Hollow doesn't truly end. It lingers, like a shadow waiting to creep into the lives of those who dare to cross its path. Emily and Dylan made their sacrifices, but the darkness doesn't forget. The curse lives on, and Sarah's fight is far from over. But tell me, my friends, if you were faced with the choice, to save yourself or to tether the darkness, what would you do? As always, I am Mr. Dark, and I thank you for venturing into the shadows with me tonight. Until we meet again, remember, not all stories stay locked in the past. Some, like Black Hollow, are always watching. Sleep well, if you can.